right? So why couldn't Google have just said, look, Facebook's better than any social network we're going to make. Why don't we just make Gmail integrate really well with it, and make, you know, Google Contacts integrate really well with it, and all that sort of stuff. And I think the problem was that Google really wanted these integrated services to all work really well together. You know, connect up well between all the different things. And the problem is, imagine that Google had made a huge investment in, you know, making everything link up really well with Facebook. The problem that it would face at that point is that Facebook could then say, oh, you really want to link up with us? Let's charge you $1 billion, you know, dollars, right? For the right. You know, given that you've already made this huge investment in linking up with us, you know, you better pay us for all the benefits you're going to get, right? And knowing that, Google doesn't want to make the investment because it knows that it's going to get screwed by Apple, right? By Facebook. And so what Grossman and Hart emphasized is it makes a lot of sense for Google to actually own the social network that it's linking up with if it's going to make these big investments, because it knows it won't exploit itself, basically. It knows it won't get exploited. Yeah?
Wouldn't that only work like if the firm is like a monopoly, if there's only one Facebook? But if you're like a car manufacturer and you need somebody to paint your car, and there's 50 people lining up to paint, you know, like, the car for you.
Well, so that, you know, that's a good point. But the key is not whether there's a monopoly ex ante, but once you've made the investment. So if I make the investment in linking up with Facebook, then Facebook's a monopolist over me, even if there are a lot of different social networks that I could link up with. Terrence?
Most applications are done like both sides. For example, the new Nespresso coffee machines.
Yeah. This happens on all sides. So it's a very pervasive problem, and that's the reason why Grossman and Hart put so much emphasis on it. So there's also lots of other reasons why you might have things within a company. One is just physical proximity. It might be valuable, you know, just to have everyone in the same building because then it's easier to monitor people, for example. Corporate culture can spill over when people are actually part of the same company, right? So if you want to inspire people to serve, you know, the goals of Apple, you might want to put an Apple name on a company rather than just having some other store sell the Apple stuff. So that's one reason Apple owns its own stores, because it creates this corporate culture. Another reason is that I might want you, your store, to only carry Apple products. I don't want you to get distracted selling some Microsoft products and some Apple products. I want you to just focus on selling my products, right? It's also easier to communicate ideas within a company. So you know if I tell you an idea, you won't run off and do something that will screw over the company with it, right? You're forced to keep that idea within the company. So that's another reason you might want to be a company. So there's lots of, and actually one really important reason that my wife actually works on is that, which actually goes in the opposite direction, is you might want to hire subcontracted workers rather than having them work for the firm, because it makes it really hard to unionize, right? Because if there's all these different workers doing all these different things from different companies, it's very hard for them to form a union across those companies. You might do it just to keep unions away. So there's all these advantages of, you know, being in a company or doing things outside of a company. And yet, there's lots of companies that actually look a lot more like their markets than like their companies. So I don't really have time to go through these examples very much, but you know, Xerox is constantly spinning off little companies that it develops within it to be separate companies. So it doesn't really work very much like that arm of Xerox doesn't really work much like a company. It works more like a venture capitalist. Google has all these very different separate services that interact with one another almost like they were separate companies. General Motors Acceptance Corporation is one of the largest corporations in the world, and it was part of General Motors, but all it did was, it was a bank. I mean, there was really no sense in which it was part of General Motors except that it was making auto loans for them. Conglomerates with different brands, PepsiCo and so forth, have like a zillion different brands, right? And like these things might as well be separate companies in a lot of ways. And News Corporation recently is a particularly crazy example of that. They had all these British newspapers, but like nobody else in the rest of the company seemed to know what these, well at least that's what they claimed, seemed to know what the heck these guys were doing. So it wasn't like they were really one company, it was like they were, you know, different companies. If you think about the government, different parts of the government act so independently of one another, right? They don't really run like one company. Parts of investment banks sell things to each other and actually take opposite investment positions often. And there's many, many other examples of companies that actually look more like they were markets. On the other hand, there's markets that look more like they were a single company. So airline alliances. You hardly even notice when you fly abroad that one leg of the trip was by American and one leg of the trip was by Iberia or whatever their partner is. And in fact, often you don't even notice at all because all the airlines are listed on the same thing. They're all code shared, and you don't even know that which airline you're on at any given moment. So that seems like they're a company, but it's done without them being part of the actual company. Dedicated restaurants at the University of Chicago. Those are separate, but they might as well just be, part of UChicago. Franchises of restaurants, dedicated separate suppliers. There's a gym in Redmond, Washington that only serves Microsoft. It's absolutely massive, and that Microsoft basically tells the gym what to do, but it's a separate company, right? So in what sense, Microsoft may as well just have its own on-campus gym. If you think about the relationship between the Mac apartments and the University of Chicago, I think that's another good example. Labor subcontracting in Latin America. There's just a zillion examples of cases where formally companies are separate, but in reality they're a lot closer than a lot of those other companies I was telling you about, which were formally all the same company. So I think what that leads us to think about is whether the distinction between what's inside of a company and what's outside of a company really matters very much, right? Because it's certainly the case that if relationships within a group are close, it makes a lot of sense to have them be, officially the same company. But but there's a lot of different factors that we went through that might lead you to want to make things inside the company or outside the company. And any one of the explanations we were talking about can almost certainly be solved by some sort of contractual relationship, as we saw in all those examples, right? And so I think, what that leads us to is that we should really think of firms not as whether it's in the formal company or out of the formal company, but rather how it operates in practice. So it will often make a lot of sense for us to divide up one legal entity called a firm into many parts and analyze them separately. Think about what their competing objectives are, right? And on the other hand, it all often makes sense for us to take many separate legal firms and for the purposes of our analysis, just treat them as if they're one firm, making a coherent profit maximizing decision. And so I think that what that leads us to is that firms are really a sort of cluster of institutions, of people, of assets, which may or may not be legally the same company, but which operate in a relatively coherent manner and that we can think of as maximizing their profits together. So that's it for the lecture, and I left 3 minutes at the end to answer all your questions. So who had questions? Anyone have questions? Yeah.
So about the incentives part that you're going to do for basically is what you're saying, at top levels, generally hard incentives work quite well, and then at lower levels, soft incentives, because the top level people tend to have greater effects on stuff like stock prices.
I mean, I think it's a mix. I mean, I wouldn't generalize that way necessarily. I think you're probably right that plays at least some role, but what really matters is how measurable things are. Because sometimes at the low levels, things can be very measurable. Like, for example, at a lot of call centers, you can measure exactly how satisfied the customers were because you get them to take all the surveys. You can measure everything. And then hard incentives work really great there. Whereas the manager of the whole call center thing might have all sorts of weird things he can be doing, deciding whether he's going to build a factory somewhere, etc. But I think the key thing is measurability versus non-measurability, not the level of seniority, but it might be correlated with the level of seniority. Yeah?
One technical question about the incentives portion.
Yeah.
For managers, were we talking about managers, low-level managers, or higher-level managers, or managers in general?
As I said, it's turtles all the way down. So almost everything that I said applies, I think, to all levels, except the financing part that I was talking about is usually going to apply to the highest level managers, right? But that's just an example of the broader incentive problems that we went through, which I think apply at all levels of management. I mean, leadership is going to usually be more effective to influence lower level people, right? And these harder incentives are usually going to be used more often for higher level people, but it